In the vastness of the galaxy, where stars are scattered like distant embers in an endless night, time flows strangely, measured not by days or years but by the cold hum of machines and the faint pulse of distant suns. Worlds drift silently in orbit, many abandoned, others caught in the quiet desperation of survival, their skies streaked with storm and shadow. Even in this boundless expanse, the presence of life is fragile, fleeting, and yet, against all odds, humanity persists. On these worlds, the Emperor of mankind casts a silent gaze, watching over a creation built of blood, steel, and unwavering faith. From this divine oversight emerges a vision of perfection, a hope that can inspire or destroy. Yet perfection carries with it shadows, hidden in the folds of destiny, waiting for the right moment to manifest. Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's favorite, came into this universe not by chance but by deliberate design. He was one of 20 Primarchs, each scattered across the stars by forces beyond comprehension, each carrying within them a fragment of the Emperor's own will. Horus arrived on the ash-choked world of Sithonia, a planet scarred by ceaseless conflict and the bitterness of survival. The moment he stepped onto its soil, a quiet stillness fell over the land, as if the planet itself recognized the significance of his presence. Even as a child, Horus radiated a natural authority, a charisma that drew the hearts of those around him like iron to a magnet. His gaze could both reassure and unsettle, an uncanny duality that hinted at the greatness and danger within him. The people of Sithonia, hardened by endless wars and the cruelty of fate, instinctively gravitated toward him. They saw not just a leader but a savior, a being capable of uniting fractured tribes under a common purpose. As Horus grew, so too did his understanding of power, of influence, and of the fragile nature of loyalty. He learned to inspire without coercion, to command without fear, and to mold devotion as if it were clay in his hands. And yet, beneath this brilliance, small shadows began to stir, subtle whispers of doubt, fleeting moments of unease, hints that not all was entirely as it seemed. The seeds of temptation, planted by forces unseen, began to take root, nurtured by the very greatness that drew others to him. Horus did not walk alone. The galaxy bore other Primarchs, each scattered across distant worlds, each a living legend in their own right. Sanguinius, radiant and noble with wings that shimmered like twin suns. Lemon Russ, fierce and untamed, a predator among men. Rogel Dorn, unwavering and stoic, a fortress incarnate. Together, they were a family, though separated by distance, circumstance, and the burdens of their own divinity. Each carried the weight of the Imperium, the responsibility to protect humanity, and the isolation that comes from being more than human. In the presence of his brothers, Horus stood brightest, yet even he could not escape the subtle shadows of doubt, the quiet erosion of innocence that accompanies power. The Imperium itself is a living paradox, an empire that spans millions of worlds, magnificent yet horrifying, a civilization that reveres humanity while demanding its subjugation. On Forge worlds, tech priests labor ceaselessly, bodies augmented with metal, minds surrendered to the will of the machine god. Their devotion is obsessive, their humanity a faint echo beneath layers of ritual and circuitry. The air is thick with the scent of heated metal, the tang of burning oil, and the quiet, omnipresent hum of servo-arms. Space Marines, too, march endlessly across battlefields, their ceramite armor a second skin, their hearts and minds bound to duty. The cost of such perfection is invisible to most, yet palpable to those who see closely. The subtle diminishment of individuality, the fading pulse of empathy, the slow, relentless encroachment of alien logic upon human instinct. Amid these towering symbols of devotion and power, Horus rose not merely as a warrior or commander, but as the Emperor's chosen, the embodiment of hope for a galaxy teetering on the edge of chaos. He moved through his domains with effortless grace, yet beneath his calm exterior, an almost imperceptible tension thrummed like a hidden current. He sensed the galaxy's quiet despair, the whispers of disquiet that lingered in dark corridors, the subtle shifts in loyalty and desire, even the hum of machinery, the rhythmic clang of armor, the faint hiss of hydraulic servos seemed alive with intent, as if the universe itself were both observer and conspirator. In those early years, the galaxy seemed tranquil, deceptively so. Planets rotated slowly in their orbits, stars gleamed in silent harmony, and life, fragile and fleeting, carried on in muted routines. Civilians labored in factories, children played in streets that survived despite war, and soldiers trained for conflicts that felt distant, almost dreamlike. Yet even in this calm, the first signs of unease were present, subtle and easily dismissed. A tech priest lingering over a corrupted cog, a space marine pausing, shivering despite the protection of his power armor, a starship's reactor stuttering for a heartbeat, sending a shiver through the hull, a reminder that even in the heart of order, imperfection waits. These minor anomalies, innocuous at first glance, hinted at a greater turbulence beneath the surface, a slow encroachment of forces that would one day shatter the galaxy's fragile balance. Horus, in these moments of quiet, was both observer and participant. He saw, understood, and yet remained insulated by his own nature. His presence inspired loyalty, but it also carried isolation. The grandeur of the Primarch's mind, the clarity of his purpose, and the weight of his responsibilities created a space between him and those he commanded. Empathy became a tool rather than an instinct, trust a calculated risk, and morality a malleable concept defined by necessity. Even as he walked among mortals and immortals alike, Horus began to sense that the universe held more than it revealed, that destiny's threads were intertwined with peril, temptation, and unseen corruption. The galaxy itself seemed to breathe around him, alive with subtle motion and quiet menace. The hiss of airlocks, the low vibration of distant engines, the flicker of lights along endless corridors, all conspired to create a sense of presence and anticipation. Storms raged on distant planets, their winds howling through desolate valleys, carrying the scent of ozone and ionized air. The cold touch of steel contrasted with the warmth of human hands, reminding one of the fragile boundary between life and the machinery that now defined much of existence. Even in moments of calm, there was a sense of lurking inevitability. The faint pulse of things that could not yet be named, felt only as unease in the chest, a tremor in the mind. Horus's childhood and early leadership molded him into a figure both revered and feared. He learned that power could command loyalty, that charisma could unite armies, and that strength without compassion could still inspire devotion. In the shadowed corridors of fortress monasteries and the open plains of conquered worlds, he honed these gifts. Yet as he excelled, so too did the subtle erosion of the human spirit. Moments of doubt, fleeting as they were, began to whisper of temptation, of paths unseen, of choices that might one day lead to ruin. And while the galaxy slept, blind to the coming storm, Horus walked a path that only he could fully perceive, each step carrying him closer to the precipice where loyalty and ambition, honor and corruption would collide. Even among the sons of the Emperor, isolation was inevitable. Sanguinius with his radiant wings, his nobility unshakable, Lemon Russ, the wolf prince unrestrained and wild, Rogel Dorn, the immovable fortress of a man. Each was a mirror reflecting some facet of Horus's own being, yet none could truly understand the burden he bore. Among peers, he shone brightest, yet the light he cast was not without shadows. In private moments, away from eyes and ears, Horus felt the subtle tug of something foreign, a whisper in the mind that hinted at power, glory, and danger beyond the Emperor's command. It was seductive and faint, like a current beneath calm waters, and he could not ignore its pull. The galaxy, in its seeming serenity, carried countless small horrors, unnoticed yet omnipresent. Machines hummed with hidden life, their programming shaped by devotion but capable of malfunction and mischief. Stars flared and died without warning. Worlds were consumed by fire and warp storms, and whispers of entities beyond comprehension drifted through the void. In the midst of this, Horus moved with grace and certainty, yet the first seeds of unease had been planted. The universe, in all its vastness, seemed to anticipate a fracture, a betrayal, a turning point that would redefine the fate of humanity and the Imperium itself. As the narrative begins, the galaxy is tranquil in appearance but turbulent beneath its surface. Every action, every breath, every decision carries weight beyond measure. Horus, brilliant and magnetic, walks a path lined with both hope and foreboding, unaware that the choices he makes now will echo across millennia. The hum of machinery, the clatter of distant footsteps, the hiss of servo motors, and the faint whisper of voices long gone all create a symphony of subtle unease. The audience, lulled into a sense of calm by the gentle cadence of narration, begins to sense the quiet horror lurking in the corners of this universe. The shadow of chaos, the fragility of humanity, the inevitability of betrayal. Horus Lupercal's rise among the stars was not simply a matter of destiny. It was a careful orchestration of will, circumstance, and the intricate machinery of a galaxy built for both awe and terror. Even before he had taken command of his first legion, before he had ever stood on the bridge of a battle cruiser or issued a command that would shift the fates of millions, he carried within him the duality of greatness and flaw, the tension between loyalty and ambition, duty and desire. The Primarchs were designed to be perfect in body, mind, and spirit, yet in that very perfection lay the seed of isolation. Each of them was a living monolith, a mirror reflecting what humanity could become, yet also a stark reminder of what it would never fully achieve. Horus, more than any of his brothers, embodied both the promise and the peril of that vision. His charisma radiated naturally, a subtle gravitational pull that drew both mortals and immortals to his cause. But behind the warmth of his presence, there was a mind constantly calculating, perceiving the universe in layers, reading intentions, anticipating outcomes, and sensing the faint stirrings of forces that others could neither see nor understand. Horus's legion, the Luna Wolves, was a reflection of his nature. Fierce, disciplined, and loyal, the warriors under his command admired him as both father and brother, leader and confidant. They followed him not out of fear, but out of a devotion that bordered on reverence, as if his will alone could bend the galaxy toward order. Yet for all their loyalty, the human element, their shared fears, desires, and limitations, was gradually subsumed beneath the weight of duty and training. Each soldier, each officer, became not merely an extension of Horus's command, but a participant in a subtle transformation, a slow erosion of identity that mirrored their Primarch's own struggle. Loyalty became obsession, courage became compulsion. The line between man and instrument blurred until only the veneer of individual thought remained. Horus himself was acutely aware of the cost of his own power. Even as he inspired those around him, he recognized the isolation imposed by his nature. Conversations with mortals, no matter how well-meaning, were filtered through a lens of incomprehension. He perceived nuances and implications they could not express, and their limited understanding of the universe left him feeling detached. Interactions with his brothers were more complex, though equally isolating. Each Primarch was unique, yet each carried the weight of expectation and destiny. Some, like Sanguinius, radiated an innate nobility that both comforted and unnerved him, a reminder of what was possible when divinity and empathy coexisted. Others, like Lemon Russ, were wild and untamed, a living reminder that instinct and brutality could coexist with loyalty, though in a form Horus could never fully embrace. These interactions shaped him, deepening his understanding of leadership, but also fostering a growing awareness of limits, both imposed upon him and those he imposed upon others. The Imperium of man, vast and intricate, demanded such understanding. Worlds were managed not by empathy alone, but by careful orchestration of power, the application of strategy, and the manipulation of belief. Horus learned to balance these forces, to wield the levers of faith and fear with precision. In his hands, the Imperium did not merely survive, it flourished. Yet even as he succeeded, he became increasingly conscious of the fragility of order, the thinness of the veil that separated civilization from chaos. Every victory carried with it a shadow. Every conquered world left remnants of fear, grief, or resentment that festered unseen. Horus's insight into this delicate equilibrium, his ability to perceive both the tangible and the intangible, was both a gift and a burden. The weight of knowledge, the constant awareness of unseen consequences, created a subtle strain upon his mind, a strain that would later become a conduit for darker influences. Even as a Primarch, Horus experienced the human cost of power. Though his body was engineered to perfection, capable of feats impossible for mortals, the mind remained tethered to mortality, to emotion, to desire. The longing for connection, for recognition, for understanding, persisted beneath the armor of intellect and charisma. In moments of solitude, he felt the faint ache of what had been lost in his elevation, the spontaneity of childhood, the comfort of simple companionship, the vulnerability that comes from knowing that one's choices matter in a world of equal participants. This absence, quiet but persistent, created a space within him where subtle doubt could grow, where whispers of temptation could find foothold, and where the eventual corruption could begin to seep through. The influence of chaos, at first imperceptible, began as a murmur, a sensation that grew only in subtlety. In the void between stars, where warp storms raged and the fabric of reality thinned, Horus felt disturbances he could not immediately interpret. These were not mere anomalies in physics or the aftermath of psychic turbulence. They were hints of intelligence, awareness beyond mortal comprehension. At first, he dismissed them as natural occurrences, anomalies to be studied and corrected. Yet over time, the whispers grew persistent, drawing his attention, speaking in the quiet spaces of contemplation, offering insight, power, understanding. The lure was not overt but insidious, framing itself as counsel, guidance, the promise of mastery over fate itself. Horus, like all beings of immense perception, sensed the underlying danger but could not fully resist the allure. The sensation was intoxicating, a sense that the universe itself conspired to reveal truths hidden from even the Emperor's gaze. Within the Luna Wolves, the effects of Horus's growing awareness manifested in subtle ways. His strategies became more daring, his commands more nuanced, and his soldiers responded with an almost preternatural cohesion. Yet beneath this effectiveness lay hints of unease. Some warriors reported faint, inexplicable feelings of dread or hallucination, as if the very air around them had changed. Others described mechanical failures that seemed too precise to be random, systems faltering in a manner that mirrored the psychological undercurrents of their commander. These disturbances were always minor, almost imperceptible but cumulative, creating a pervasive sense that something in the galaxy was shifting, something beyond mortal comprehension, and that Horus, brilliant and charismatic though he was, moved along with it, neither fully aware nor fully in control. Horus's relationship with the Emperor was central to his identity. The Emperor, both father and mentor, represented the ultimate standard, the culmination of human aspiration and divine purpose. Horus's loyalty was absolute, his admiration profound, yet even in this veneration there existed subtle tension. The Emperor's expectations were immense, often unspoken, and Horus felt the pressure of each decision, each maneuver, as though he were balancing not just his legion or a planet's fate, but the will of the galaxy itself. In his quieter moments, Horus questioned whether absolute loyalty was sustainable, whether the rigid boundaries of duty left space for genuine agency, and whether the destiny laid before him was a path to greatness or to annihilation. These questions, often suppressed, festered beneath the surface, creating internal dissonance that would later amplify the whispers of corruption. Horus's psychology was further complicated by his awareness of mortality within the impermanence of the galaxy. Though the body of a Primarch was near invincible, the fragility of human life surrounded him everywhere. Mortals who fell to disease, to violence, to misfortune, often under his command or in his presence. Each loss left an echo in his mind, a subtle reminder that perfection was always incomplete, that influence and power could never fully shield those he cared for. Over time, this awareness sharpened his strategic mind, made him empathetic in subtle ways, and simultaneously created a hunger for certainty, for control, for the ability to shape outcomes beyond the reach of chaos, chance, or mortality. It was this craving, quiet and persistent, that allowed the first seeds of darker influence to take root. The galaxy itself seemed to conspire in Horus's transformation. Worlds in ruin, systems under siege, the constant hum of war and decay. It created a mental environment in which the line between necessity and morality blurred. Decisions that might have been shocking under other circumstances became acceptable, even rational. The cost of imperfection, the toll of hesitancy, became tangible, and Horus began to internalize the notion that in a universe of endless conflict, perfection demanded compromise, and compromise demanded sacrifice. These rationalizations, initially subtle and almost imperceptible, gradually reshaped the very architecture of his mind, creating corridors through which chaos could one day pass unimpeded. The technological environment of the Imperium also played its role in shaping Horus's consciousness. In the sanctums of his legion, the whirring of servo-arms, the hiss of hydraulics, the faint mechanical pulse of augmentation, all combined to create a backdrop in which organic and synthetic intelligence coexisted uneasily. Horus observed these machines, revered their precision, and reflected on the limits of human potential. The devotion of tech priests, their willingness to surrender flesh to metal and mind to ritual, fascinated him. It demonstrated the possibilities inherent in the fusion of humanity and technology, yet it also revealed the subtle dangers, the slow erosion of identity, the gradual surrender of the soul to machinery. These observations shaped his understanding of power and obedience, and they reinforced the growing tension between his inherent humanity and the demands of destiny. Horus's internal world was a complex interplay of admiration, doubt, ambition, and fear. He recognized the fragility of those around him, the limitations of mortal understanding, and the vast potential inherent in the Primarchs themselves. He perceived the subtle nuances of influence, the latent power in suggestion, the unspoken currents of desire and fear. These insights allowed him to command with unparalleled effectiveness, yet they also created a fertile ground for manipulation by forces beyond his comprehension. The whispers of chaos, initially vague and indistinct, began to resonate more clearly, their timbre aligning with his own desires for certainty, control, and the preservation of what he perceived as order. The seductive nature of these forces was never overt. It worked in concert with his existing tendencies, amplifying doubts, magnifying ambition, and creating pathways that led inexorably toward corruption. Even as Horus maintained his public persona of unwavering loyalty and charismatic leadership, a private evolution was underway. He questioned the rigidity of imperial dogma, the unyielding authority of the emperor, and the ultimate costs of obedience. These internal debates, hidden from all but his closest confidants and eventually only from himself, created a psychological tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Horus's perception of reality became layered, a constant negotiation between external expectation and internal desire, between what was right and what was necessary, between duty and aspiration. It was within this tension, delicate and precise, that the forces of corruption began to work, exploiting fissures that existed naturally in the mind of even the most loyal Primarch. Horus's legion, his brothers, and the Imperium itself were all components in a complex system of influence and consequence. The galaxy's vastness amplified both his power and his isolation. Every choice he made carried ramifications that span light years. Every command resonated across worlds, and every action was observed, consciously or unconsciously, by entities capable of subtle manipulation. The scale of responsibility was staggering, and the mental acuity required to navigate it created a strain on his perception of self. In moments of reflection, Horus sensed the faint currents of something alien, something patient and calculating, observing, waiting. These sensations were difficult to articulate, more intuition than conscious thought, yet they left an indelible mark on his psyche. The nature of Horus's character was defined by contrasts: strength and vulnerability, loyalty and doubt, humanity and divinity all coexisted uneasily within him. He was capable of inspiring unparalleled devotion, yet he was also capable of private reflection that revealed his insecurities and longings. He understood strategy and philosophy, war and diplomacy, yet he remained tethered to instinctual desires for recognition, connection, and control. These qualities, interwoven with his physical perfection and charismatic presence, created a complex psychological tapestry, one that would ultimately define not only his actions but the trajectory of the Imperium itself. Horus's awareness of his own limitations, juxtaposed against the seemingly limitless potential of his brothers and the galaxy itself, created both humility and hubris. He recognized that perfection was unattainable, yet he sought it relentlessly in himself, in his legion, and in the execution of the Emperor's will. This pursuit, noble in intention, was subtly flawed, for it did not account for the fragility of human, or even Primarch, psychology. The seeds of doubt and ambition, when combined with the persistent whispers of chaos, created an internal landscape that was both fertile and perilous, a place where certainty and fear intertwined, and where the first fractures of corruption could easily take hold. The psychological evolution of Horus, and the subtle transformations occurring within his legion, illustrate the intricate interplay between power, perception, and morality. The Imperium, while vast and ordered, provided the framework for both greatness and catastrophe. Horus, brilliant and capable, navigated this environment with skill, yet his very genius created pathways for influence that were imperceptible yet profound. In the quiet moments of contemplation, when he stood upon the bridge of his flagship or walked the silent corridors of a conquered world, he felt the weight of the galaxy's gaze, the pressure of expectation, and the quiet stirrings of forces that would one day bend him toward a destiny he had never consciously chosen. The nature of Horus Lupercal, then, is one of complexity, contrast, and inevitability. He is a figure of immense charisma, strategic brilliance, and heroic potential, yet he is simultaneously susceptible to doubt, temptation, and subtle corruption. His character is defined not by a single trait or event, but by the interplay of countless forces, internal, external, and cosmic, that shape perception, influence action, and determine fate. Within this tapestry of experience, loyalty and ambition, humanity and divinity, strength and vulnerability coexist, creating a being capable of inspiring devotion and fear in equal measure. It is this delicate equilibrium, constantly negotiated and perpetually tested, that forms the essence of the Primarch's nature, setting the stage for the profound and tragic transformation that will follow. The galaxy, for all its grandeur, has always been a place of quiet menace, a void punctuated by the dim gleam of distant stars, the faint hum of machinery, and the soft whisper of wind over barren landscapes. In these moments, when the eyes perceive the calm of light years and the mind imagines the serenity of orbiting worlds, there is a subtle, almost imperceptible undercurrent of unease. It begins with small anomalies, things that could easily be dismissed: a flicker of light in the corner of vision, the faint hiss of a vent out of sync with the rhythm of the starship, the sense that a shadow lingers just a fraction too long in a corridor. For Horus Lupercal, attuned to both the majesty and fragility of existence, these disturbances were like soft tremors beneath a surface of polished steel. At first, He noted them as curiosities, passing observations made while his mind wandered through strategy, leadership, and the endless calculus of war. Yet over time, the murmurs of unease grew, subtle as they were, threading themselves into consciousness like tiny cracks in otherwise perfect armor. The Luna Wolves moved through the galaxy with the precision of a disciplined machine, yet even in their flawless formations, there were hints that all was not as it seemed. A soldier might glance toward the shadows and perceive a flicker of movement that had no source, a creak of metal that was neither structural nor mechanical. Horus noticed the same thing when he stood upon the bridge of his flagship, staring into the void. The stars seemed to shimmer in unnatural patterns, distant suns casting light that twisted and bent, defying reason, and in the quiet hum of engines, he thought he could hear faint whispers, just beyond comprehension. These were not ordinary sounds. They had cadence, intent, a rhythm that suggested consciousness, a subtle echo of something foreign, watching, waiting. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The sensation was not immediate terror. It was subtle, a quiet suggestion that reality might be slightly thinner than perceived, that the order he imposed on the galaxy was not as absolute as he believed. In the quiet moments between campaigns, Horus found himself reflecting on these oddities. Alone in the sanctum of his quarters, he would listen to the faint vibrations through the deck plating, feel the minute shifts of pressure in the air, the ever-present hum of systems designed to sustain life and amplify control. Sometimes the ship's lights would flicker, shadows stretching across walls in ways that defied the geometry of the corridors. These were minor irregularities, but persistent, cumulative, and unnerving. When he spoke of them to his closest advisors, he found that others either dismissed the sensations or failed to perceive them entirely, as though his heightened awareness allowed him glimpses into a layer of existence the rest of the galaxy could not see. That realization, that he was alone in perception as he had often been alone in purpose, planted the first seeds of anxiety, an understanding that the calm exterior of the Imperium was deceptive, fragile, and that beneath its veneer of order lay currents that could bend and break with little warning. The tech priests, with their ceaseless devotion to the machine god, were among the first to draw his attention in these subtle disturbances. Their bodies, twisted and augmented, were conduits of technology and ritual, their minds intertwined with circuitry in a way that rendered them both incredibly powerful and disturbingly alien. They moved with unnatural grace, their servo-arms glinting in the dim light, their faces partially obscured by augmetic lenses, and every movement precise, calculated, and devoid of what humans would call spontaneity. Yet even these beings, devoted to logic and worship, were not immune to subtle corruption, and Horus noticed moments where a tech priest hesitated, their systems flickering in rhythm with irregular patterns of thought, suggesting influences they did not, or could not, acknowledge. It was in these small imperfections, the minute glitches in otherwise perfect behavior, that Horus first glimpsed the fragility inherent in even the most disciplined minds. Among the Luna Wolves, whispers began to circulate in quiet moments, always subtle, always tentative. A soldier might feel a presence behind them when none existed. They would report a shadow in the corner of a chamber that vanished when approached, or hear distant voices in a passageway long abandoned. These events, once brushed aside as nerves or fatigue, began to form a pattern, a slow and deliberate drumbeat of unease. Horus observed these behaviors carefully, noting that his legion's efficiency remained undiminished, yet the emotional atmosphere shifted. Anxiety, unease, and subtle paranoia grew, even among the most stalwart warriors. It was as if the galaxy itself were pressing against them, testing their resilience, whispering secrets that could neither be fully understood nor fully ignored. Horus's own experiences mirrored these minor disturbances. During meditative periods when he sought clarity and guidance, he felt faint pulses within his own mind, like echoes of thoughts not his own. Dreams, once vivid and fantastical, began to take on darker tones, populated by shadows that did not follow natural logic, by visions of stars consumed by blackness, by indistinct figures whose faces were familiar yet wrong. He would wake in cold sweat, the sense of wrongness lingering, an almost tactile pressure on the chest, a quiet terror that could not be spoken aloud. It was in these early moments that Horus began to recognize that the galaxy was not simply a stage for his actions, but an entity capable of perception, intent, and perhaps even judgment. The realization was deeply unsettling, for it implied that control was always partial, that even the most brilliant strategies were vulnerable to forces unseen, and that what seemed calm was merely the surface of a deeper, more sinister truth. The stars themselves, usually constant and reliable, became instruments of subtle anxiety. Horus noticed patterns, irregularities in light and shadow, in stellar radiation, in the rhythm of solar flares. Systems would report anomalies in navigational data that could not be explained by sensor malfunctions. Communications that had once been clear and reliable were sometimes punctuated by faint whispers or distorted transmissions, carrying syllables that seemed meaningful yet could not be deciphered. These minor distortions, almost imperceptible, were enough to unsettle even a Primarch, whose mind was trained to interpret and manage chaos with precision. The unease was cumulative, layering over his perception of the galaxy, threading into his consciousness like a slow-acting toxin, imperceptible at first, but undeniably present. The influence of chaos, while not yet overt, began to manifest in these small distortions. It whispered through the machinery of starships, through the routines of the Luna Wolves, through dreams and contemplations, as if testing the limits of perception and morality. Horus did not recognize it for what it was at first. He thought these were simply anomalies, the inevitable consequences of war, of distance, of the incomprehensible scale of the Imperium. Yet each anomaly carried with it a weight of suggestion, a subtle framing of thought that encouraged doubt, mistrust, and introspection. In the quiet of his command chambers, Horus found himself questioning decisions, strategies, and even the righteousness of the Emperor's mandate, all under the guise of rational analysis. The line between logical caution and insidious suggestion blurred, creating a fertile ground for the horrors that would later unfold. The soldiers under Horus's command became both participants in and witnesses to these early manifestations. During training, they occasionally reported hearing voices calling their names, distant footsteps echoing in unoccupied halls, or flickers of movement at the edge of their vision. These incidents were dismissed as fatigue or stress by some, yet others could not ignore the patterns. Small groups began to develop a shared awareness of these disturbances, an unspoken acknowledgement that something beyond their understanding was present. Horus observed this with a mixture of curiosity and concern, recognizing that the subtle erosion of perception could, if unchecked, weaken even the strongest bonds of loyalty and camaraderie. At the same time, he felt a perverse fascination with these phenomena, a desire to understand and even to harness them, unaware that in doing so he was opening a door to forces beyond his control. The environments Horus encountered contributed to the atmosphere of unease. Storm-lashed worlds with skies roiling in perpetual tempest, planets scarred by centuries of warfare, void stations creaking under the strain of gravity and decay. All were settings that magnified the psychological tension within the Luna Wolves. The smell of ozone, of scorched metal, of ionized air combined with the tactile sensation of cold steel underfoot to create a sensory environment that was at once familiar and alien. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, reflections warped in the polished surfaces of armor and machinery, and the faint hum of systems carried a tone that was almost musical, yet dissonant in ways that the mind could not fully rationalize. The galaxy itself in these moments felt alive, aware, and patient, its vastness both protective and predatory. Even within the sanctums of his own mind, Horus began to notice changes. Moments of reflection became intertwined with fleeting images of impossible landscapes, visions of stars collapsing into darkness, of machinery consuming flesh, of faces familiar yet distorted. These mental intrusions were subtle at first, fleeting as shadows at dusk, but their persistence created a growing unease, a suggestion that perception itself was not entirely reliable. His dreams, once spaces of rest and renewal, became landscapes of ambiguity, populated by figures who spoke in riddles, moved with impossible geometry, and vanished when approached. In these moments, the boundaries between reality and hallucination blurred, and Horus felt, for the first time, the intimate terror of uncertainty. The early horror did not manifest as overt violence or catastrophe. It was quieter, more insidious, a slow erosion of certainty, a whisper in the mind, a flicker of shadow. Horus noticed these changes in his own decisions. Strategies that had once seemed straightforward became fraught with doubt. Tactics that had been second nature required contemplation, and even the certainty of loyalty among his legion seemed subtly less absolute. It was as if the very universe conspired to test him, to probe the edges of perception and morality, to plant seeds of suspicion and curiosity that would one day bear fruit in ways both glorious and terrible. Interactions with other Primarchs carried their own subtleties. Sanguinius, radiant and noble, seemed unaffected, his presence a calm in the storm. Yet Horus sensed that even he could not perceive all layers of influence. Lemon Russ, unpredictable and instinct-driven, brushed aside anomalies as inconsequential. Yet his very disregard created friction in their interactions, a reminder that perception and belief were individual, and that the weight of unseen forces might press differently upon each mind. Rogel Dorn's unwavering stoicism was both comforting and unnerving, a mirror in which Horus could glimpse both his own resolve and the shadow of his emerging doubts. These relational dynamics, subtle as they were, contributed to a growing sense of isolation, reinforcing the quiet horror that was beginning to take root. The early horror was amplified by the machinery and technology that defined the Imperium. Starships thrummed with life, but that life was mechanical, precise, and often inscrutable. Servoarms moved with uncanny coordination. Reactors pulsed with rhythms that seemed almost alive, and consoles displayed readouts that hinted at patterns no human, or Primarch, was meant to decipher fully. The hum of engines, once comforting, became a constant reminder of the presence of systems beyond comprehension. Small failures, irregularities in data streams, and inexplicable malfunctions were increasingly common, each minor anomaly reinforcing the perception that control was never complete, that the universe held more than it revealed, and that unseen forces might be shaping outcomes even in the presence of unparalleled command. Even rituals, both mundane and sacred, took on an unnerving aspect. Tech priests performed ceremonies of maintenance and worship with mechanical precision, yet their movements, voices, and gestures occasionally slipped into patterns that were subtly wrong, disturbing to those attuned to nuance. Horus noted these deviations, though they were small, almost imperceptible, yet cumulative, layering upon his own awareness of subtle corruption and the fragility of perception. These tiny disruptions reinforced the sense that the universe itself might be shifting, that normalcy was a veneer, and that horror could emerge gradually, patiently, from the smallest irregularities. The early horror of Horus's rise, then, was not sudden nor overt. It was quiet, persistent, and psychological, manifesting as subtle anomalies, persistent doubts, and small distortions in perception and behavior. It crept into the minds of his legion, the workings of the Imperium, the relationships among Primarchs, and the patterns of star systems themselves. It was a slow, almost hypnotic tension, one that the mind could sense but could not fully articulate, and it created a pervasive unease that suggested something fundamentally wrong, something patient and intelligent, lurking just beyond comprehension, waiting for the moment to act. Horus Lupercal is both more aware and more vulnerable, attuned to the subtle horrors surrounding him, yet unknowingly walking a path toward corruption. The galaxy, vast and indifferent, presses against him from all sides, whispering suggestions, planting doubts, and shaping perception. The calm, hypnotic order established in his earlier campaigns is eroded by these subtle intrusions, creating a perfect environment for the forces of chaos and the shadow of betrayal to take root. The audience, lulled by the gentle cadence of observation, begins to feel the tension creeping under the skin, the slow escalation of horror that promises deeper darkness in the chapters to come. It is in this liminal space between calm and terror, between perception and reality, that Horus's true descent begins, quiet, patient, and inevitable. The galaxy, which had once seemed tranquil in its distant orbit, now pulsed with a quiet, insidious malice. Even the stars seemed to burn with a colder light, their brilliance hollow and distant, as though the universe itself had grown aware of the shifting balance. Horus Lupercal, once the embodiment of calm authority and magnetic presence, felt the subtle tremors of unease coalescing into something tangible, a shadow pressing against the edge of perception. The hum of the starship, once comforting and precise, now vibrated with a strange irregularity, like the faint heartbeat of some distant, sleeping predator. The hiss of pressurized conduits and the rhythmic clank of servoarms carried an unnatural cadence, almost mimicking the pattern of a human heartbeat, yet distorted and uneven. It was as if the machinery of the Imperium, long a symbol of control and perfection, had begun to whisper its own desires. In the halls of his flagship, the Luna Wolves moved with mechanical precision, yet each step seemed to echo differently, the sounds warped and elongated in ways that should have been impossible. Shadows clung to the walls and corridors as though alive, stretching into impossible geometries that defied comprehension. Sometimes, a soldier would freeze mid-step, eyes darting to a corner, only to find it empty, yet the sense of being observed remained. Whispers, faint and indistinct, seemed to drift through ventilation shafts, carrying syllables that could not be fully parsed but left a visceral impression of menace. Horus noticed these things, not merely as a commander noticing oddities, but as a being finely attuned to the resonance of the universe, the subtle pulse of life and death, order and decay. He understood, with an intuition sharpened by decades of experience, that this was no mere coincidence, no malfunction of machinery or fatigue of the mind. The galaxy itself, it seemed, was watching, testing, waiting. The Luna Wolves, for all their loyalty, were not immune to these subtle intrusions. Minor disturbances, once easily dismissed, became cumulative and undeniable. In the middle of a routine drill, a soldier's power armor might flicker, the HUD display warping with unintelligible symbols before returning to normal. Another might hear the faintest echo of their name carried across an empty deck, the sound distant yet immediate, intimate, and invasive. These incidents, initially brushed aside as minor technical anomalies or stress-induced illusions, began to create a palpable tension, a shared anxiety that could be felt by even the most disciplined veterans. Horus observed these phenomena, recognizing in them the first tangible evidence of the influence that had been building since the subtle disturbances of the early campaigns. He did not fear it, not yet, but he felt the pull, the inevitability, and it intrigued him more than it alarmed him. The first overt signs of corruption manifested not in the galaxy itself, but in the whispers of the mind. Horus found himself drawn to thoughts he would not have entertained before, contemplations of power and consequence that carried a seductive undertone. What if perfection required deviation from the strictest interpretation of loyalty? What if the Emperor's vision, grand as it was, left blind spots where greatness could be attained through alternative means? These questions, subtle and reasonable in isolation, began to accumulate, forming a cognitive current that tugged gently at the edges of conscience. They were suggestions, hints, manipulations that could be rationalized, excused, or ignored, yet their persistence gnawed at the mind, creating a tension that grew with each passing cycle of the ship's engines. The visions came next, as brief flashes during meditation or in the quiet moments before rest. Shadows of impossible figures, glimpses of landscapes that defied geometry and logic, stars collapsing into nothingness while familiar constellations twisted and convulsed. Horus observed them not merely with sight, but with a kind of resonance, a perception of pattern and intent, of logic underlying the madness. These visions were not random. They were deliberate, designed to unsettle, to shift perception, to plant seeds of doubt and curiosity. And though he recognized the threat in these hallucinations, he could not entirely resist them. There was insight within their chaos, glimpses of understanding beyond mortal comprehension, and the allure was intoxicating. The mind, hungry for mastery over the galaxy, began to crave the forbidden clarity these visions promised, even as they eroded the calm center of his perception. The physical manifestations of horror began to follow. While on a campaign to a distant system scarred by centuries of warfare, Horus observed the subtle deterioration of his warriors' augmentations. Servolimbs that had once operated flawlessly faltered for a heartbeat, armor panels warped inexplicably, and the hum of energy conduits momentarily ceased, leaving the wearer unprotected and vulnerable. Flesh, already partially replaced or augmented in many cases, began to exhibit strange patterns of irritation, discoloration, and slow necrosis, where no disease could account for it. Tech priests, normally masters of repair and ritual, appeared distracted, their movements slightly off, as if an external influence subtly constrained their precision. The combination of human frailty and mechanical failure created a sense of unease that was almost tangible, as though the very act of sustaining life through augmentation had begun to backfire, twisting bodies and minds in ways that could not yet be fully comprehended. The psychological horror intertwined seamlessly with these physical anomalies. Soldiers, aware of the creeping dysfunction, grew quiet, their eyes darting to shadows, their conversations tinged with nervous laughter that failed to conceal underlying dread. Small mutterings began to surface, subtle questions of loyalty and purpose, the kind that might have been dismissed in normal circumstances. Some whispered about dreams, impossible yet vivid, populated by figures that promised understanding or power. Others spoke of voices in the void, carrying warnings that were ambiguous yet deeply unsettling. Horus, attuned to these patterns, recognized both the danger and the inevitability. Fear, once seated, multiplies rapidly in a legion attuned to loyalty and cohesion. The Luna wolves, disciplined as they were, could not entirely resist the encroachment of this creeping unease. The galaxy itself contributed to the crescendo of horror. Warp storms raged unpredictably, consuming systems without warning, leaving behind planets stripped of life and civilization. Stars flared and dimmed in strange sequences, their radiation interfering with sensors and communications in ways that defied explanation. Navigational data became erratic, as though the fabric of space itself was being subtly manipulated, bending trajectories and time. Even communications, the constant link between worlds, were occasionally disrupted by faint, unintelligible signals, whispering in the faintest tonalities of speech, yet carrying the unmistakable cadence of intent. The cosmos, vast and patient, seemed to be alive, aware, and subtly malevolent, pressing against perception and testing the resilience of those who traversed it. Horus began to perceive this cosmic tension not merely as external phenomena, but as a mirror of his own internal state. The growing whispers, visions, and anomalies aligned with the subtle urges and ambitions within him, amplifying desires he had never fully acknowledged. Power, control, understanding, and mastery over destiny all became irresistible in the context of the galaxy's subtle provocation. The whispers of chaos, previously faint, grew more structured, presenting themselves not as threats but as opportunities, questions, and possibilities. They promised insight, strategies beyond comprehension, and the ability to shape the Imperium not merely as a commander, but as a master of fate. It was intoxicating, yet horrifying, for Horus recognized the duality. With every potential gain came the risk of irrevocable corruption, of a surrender that might never be reversed. The crescendo, intensified as tangible manifestations of alien influence, became undeniable. Shadows moved independently of light, appearing in peripheral vision with impossible timing. Sounds echoed in contradictory directions, defying acoustics. Even in the controlled environments of a starship, the laws of space and perception began to falter. Soldiers described seeing themselves from impossible angles, as if their consciousness had fractured or been observed by something beyond comprehension. The combination of body, mind, and environment created a psychological tension that was almost unbearable, a constant, low-level panic that could not be shaken. Horus, aware of the patterns and yet unable to halt them, felt the first pangs of real fear, the visceral recognition that control was an illusion, that even a Primarch could be vulnerable to forces larger than intellect or martial skill could account for. The physical horrors escalated in step with the psychological. Augmentations, once flawless extensions of the body, began to behave unpredictably. Mechanical limbs moved slightly out of sync with thought, servos groaned under invisible loads, and neural interfaces occasionally misfired, sending unintended impulses. Flesh grafted to metal or subjected to cybernetic enhancements developed necrotic lesions in patterns that mirrored chaotic symbols, faint yet discernible to the trained eye. Tech priests, normally masters of diagnosis and repair, appeared increasingly disturbed, their chants and rituals faltering mid-motion as if an unseen force interfered with both cognition and will. The Legion's efficiency, previously absolute, began to show subtle cracks, failures measured not in catastrophic events, but in moments of hesitation that carried a weight magnified by the psychological atmosphere of dread. Horus's dreams, no longer confined to the quiet spaces of rest, began to intrude upon waking thought. He envisioned galaxies folding into themselves, mechanical constructs consuming flesh, and figures with faces familiar yet twisted beyond recognition. The visions spoke, though not in words, in impressions, urges, and questions that demanded response. He felt them inside his mind as much as outside. The imperatives were urgent yet ambiguous, terrifying yet seductively logical. These intrusions eroded the boundaries of consciousness, blending perception with imagination, and creating an acute awareness that the line between reality and hallucination was no longer certain. The crescendo of horror was both internal and external, intertwined in a manner that made escape impossible. The galaxy, once a distant backdrop of stars and empty void, had become a living, breathing entity of threat and scrutiny. Horus Lupercal, the brightest of the Emperor's sons, the embodiment of both ambition and charisma, felt the culmination of all the subtle disturbances, whispers and distortions converge into a singular, overwhelming force. It began quietly, as it always had, with a dissonance in the air, a vibration beneath the deck plating of his flagship, imperceptible to anyone untrained in observation. Yet Horus, attuned to the rhythm of the universe, felt it in his bones. The hum of machinery became a chorus of indecipherable murmurs. The ventilation ducts carried whispers that seemed not only to echo sound but to echo thought, probing, questioning, enticing. He realized with a sharp, almost painful clarity that the galaxy itself had turned from observer to participant, pressing against his perception, folding the very laws of reality around him. The Luna wolves, loyal and disciplined as they were, moved with a precision that belied the chaos encroaching around them. But Horus could see the cracks in their armor, both literal and metaphorical. Servolimbs faltered in the middle of motion, HUD displays warped with cryptic symbols that suggested not malfunction, but communication, language from beyond comprehension. Soldiers froze mid-step, shadows dancing in patterns that contradicted natural physics. And yet the terror was not solely physical. It was in the air, in the silence between sounds, in the unsettling certainty that unseen eyes followed every decision, every breath, every heartbeat. Horus, despite his legendary composure, felt a shiver of unease, the first tremor of real panic stretching through the core of his being. He walked the corridors of his flagship, the floor vibrating slightly under his feet, as though the ship itself were aware of him, aware of his thoughts, his fears. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with a rhythm synchronous with his own heartbeat, yet slightly delayed, as if mocking his perception of control. The shadows, long and angular, twisted in impossible geometries, defying logic, forming shapes that suggested both the familiar and the grotesque. Each corridor, each hatch, each chamber whispered of inevitability, of forces operating on scales he could not fully comprehend. And as he passed, a subtle pressure pressed against his mind, not violent but insistent, an almost polite insistence that he see, understand, and ultimately succumb. The influence of chaos, previously a distant murmur, was now undeniable. It revealed itself not as a single entity but as a multiplicity of presences, subtle yet distinct, each probing the edges of Horus's mind. They whispered of power unattainable through loyalty alone, of freedom from the rigid dictates of the Emperor, of mastery over the galaxy unbound by dogma. These were not threats, they were promises, seductive in their clarity, and yet within each promise was an implicit danger, an understanding that every gain exacted a cost beyond comprehension. Horus, standing at the precipice of reason, felt the weight of inevitability pressing against his shoulders. He understood, as he had never before, that choice was a lie. The currents of fate were moving him inexorably toward corruption. The first overt manifestations of corporeal horror came as the very flesh and machinery of his legion began to betray their function. Power armor buckled at unexpected moments, limbs failed mid-stride, energy conduits surged in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost conscious. Flesh grafted to machine exhibited necrotic patterns that mirrored the symbols whispered to him in dreams, black veins of corruption spreading like ink through the veins of reality. Soldiers who had once been paragons of loyalty now hesitated, not from fear alone, but from the intrusion of something alien into their minds. Thoughts that were not their own, impulses they could not explain, feelings of dread they could not dissipate, all combined to form a collective psychic resonance, a vibration that Horus perceived as both melody and cacophony. Horus himself began to feel the first tangible intrusions into his own body. Neurolinks, intended to enhance cognition and perception, flashed with unreadable glyphs, the electrical impulses misaligning with his thought patterns. His enhanced reflexes betrayed him for brief, terrifying moments, responding to stimuli that were not present, anticipating attacks that did not exist, leaving him acutely aware of the tenuous boundary between control and surrender. Every movement, every perception, every calculation was shadowed by uncertainty, as if the universe itself had begun to assert influence over his actions. The psychological aspect of the horror intensified as Horus began to see his own legion through a new lens, one shaped by paranoia and the subtle corruption of thought. Soldiers whispered about visions, about figures they had seen in dreams now appearing in reality, shadows that seemed to anticipate action, and voices that spoke in languages known and unknown simultaneously. Horus noticed that these reports were not anomalies but patterns, a symphony of subtle chaos growing louder, more structured, more insistent. It was no longer the galaxy pressing gently against perception. It was a deliberate intrusion, an entity bending the will of the universe toward a purpose that was both alien and intimately familiar. In this moment, Horus felt a fracture within his own identity. He perceived the duality of his existence more acutely than ever. Primarch, warrior, servant of the Emperor, yet simultaneously observer, manipulator, and now potential vessel for forces beyond comprehension. The whispers suggested answers to questions he had not yet formulated, paths to mastery over life, death, and reality itself. But with each revelation came a gnawing awareness of cost. Each insight carried with it a shadow, a price, a surrender of that which had defined him. The terror was not immediate or dramatic. It was intimate, a creeping awareness that the self he had relied upon was no longer entirely his own. The galaxy responded to this internal tension. Warp storms flared with unprecedented intensity, devouring systems whole, consuming communication arrays, and warping gravitational constants. Sensors displayed anomalies that contradicted known physics, stars that should have burned steadily dimming and flaring in rhythms suggestive of deliberate intent. Horus, perceiving this with clarity born of both skill and psychic sensitivity, realized that these were not random events, but manifestations of the influence pressing against him and the Imperium. He understood, in a cold, ineffable way, that the universe had become both stage and participant in the unfolding horror, that the rules he had relied upon were collapsing under the weight of unseen forces. The crescendo reached further as the corporeal and psychological horrors merged. The Luna Wolves, once paragons of martial discipline, began to act with inexplicable hesitation. Some turned on their own in sudden bouts of aggression, driven by thoughts and impulses they could neither understand nor resist. Others froze mid-action, locked in paralysis as shadows moved across them with impossible fluidity. Soldiers described seeing reflections of themselves that moved independently, figures that mirrored their actions with slight delays, smiles twisted into grotesque parodies of loyalty. Horus, observing all this, felt a wave of vertiginous panic. The line between reality and hallucination had been obliterated, leaving only the unyielding pressure of external influence. The whispers intensified. No longer subtle, they became urgent, commanding, persuasive. The voices spoke in harmonics that bypassed conventional cognition, embedding suggestions directly into perception, shaping thought and action with precision that was both terrifying and intoxicating. Horus heard promises of unparalleled power, freedom from the Emperor's rigid command, and dominion over the galaxy itself. The allure was irresistible, yet the awareness of cost lingered, a cost that might not be reversible, a surrender that would consume not just flesh but the very essence of self. His mind, already fractured by years of observation, command, and exposure to subtle corruption, began to bend under the weight of these insinuations. Horus's body, too, began to betray him. Neurointerfaces pulsed with uncontrolled energy, synaptic links firing in sequences that defied intention, muscle fibers responding to stimuli that were not present, flesh grafted to machine twisted unnaturally, augmentations malfunctioning with grotesque timing, servos groaning in rhythms that seemed almost musical, yet discordant, echoing the chaos invading his mind. Pain and pleasure, terror and exhilaration, control and surrender, all coexisted in a singular, overwhelming wave, leaving him teetering on the edge of collapse. The stars themselves seemed to respond, distant suns flaring with unnatural light, their radiation pulsing in sync with the distorted rhythms of his enhanced body. Visions accelerated, collapsing time and space into fleeting impressions that defied comprehension. Horus saw himself standing at the center of the galaxy, the Emperor's throne distant yet watching, his brothers arrayed around him, yet distorted into forms both familiar and alien. Faces of friends, enemies, and soldiers blurred into a kaleidoscope of expression, each glance carrying implication, accusation, or desire. In these visions, Horus perceived the inevitability of his choices, the collapse of certainty, the seductive pull of corruption. And within these visions was the subtle promise of clarity, power, and understanding. If only he would surrender, if only he would allow the whispers to guide him fully. The horror became intimate. In his quarters, shadows coalesced into forms that moved independently, figures whose presence was felt more than seen. They whispered not just suggestions but commands, subtle yet undeniable, shaping thought and motion. Machines pulsed with awareness, their functions no longer predictable or benign. Even the air seemed to carry a consciousness, pressing upon the skin with imperceptible weight, carrying scent and tone that suggested decay, promise, and danger simultaneously. Horus felt his mind fracture into layers, some loyal, some resistant, some complicit, all under the pressure of external influence and internal desire. The boundary between self and universe had dissolved. He was simultaneously master and instrument, observer and observed. And then came the revelation. In the midst of psychic and sensory chaos, Horus perceived the full scope of what he had become and what awaited him. The whispers, visions, shadows, and anomalies were not random. They were a test, a negotiation, a ritual of cosmic significance. They revealed the ultimate truth of his existence, that loyalty, power, ambition, and identity were all constructs, fragile and malleable. The universe was neither benevolent nor indifferent. It was patient, sentient, and capable of shaping destinies with precision beyond comprehension. And he, Horus Lupercal, stood at the fulcrum, the pivot around which the fate of countless worlds and the Imperium itself would turn. The first strike of transformation was internal. Consciousness splintered, perception fractured, and identity bent. Horus realized that the whispers of chaos were not suggestions but inevitabilities, a force that required not only acknowledgement but compliance. His mind, previously a repository of strategy, loyalty, and foresight, now operated under dual rhythms: the calculated, rational thought that had always defined him, and the alien, seductive cadence of corruption that promised mastery in exchange for surrender. The terror was total yet strangely exhilarating. Fear intertwined with desire, horror with insight, until Horus no longer knew which impulses were his own, and which were borrowed from forces that defied comprehension. The galaxy had fallen into a silence that was not truly quiet. Even after the crescendo of madness, after the flares of warp storms and the collapse of systems around him, Horus Lupercal felt the presence of something vast, patient, and deliberate pressing against perception. The stars themselves no longer shone simply as distant fires, but as sentinels, their light watching, judging, and reflecting back fragments of a truth too immense to comprehend. Even in the deepest vacuum, the sense of eyes unseen, of intelligence vast and indifferent yet attentive, lingered like a chill that never passed. Horus knew, with a certainty both terrifying and exhilarating, that nothing had truly ended. The immediate horrors, the mechanical failures, the fractured perceptions, the whispering shadows, had subsided only to reveal a broader, deeper terror. The galaxy was no longer a backdrop for the ambitions of men and Primarchs, but a participant in a slow, deliberate unfolding of events. The influence of chaos, once subtle and indirect, now flowed like a river through every system, every consciousness, every mind that remained intact. Horus felt it in the vibrations of the starship, in the hum of machinery, in the whispers at the edge of perception. It was patient, pervasive, and indifferent to resistance, yet it spoke with precision and intent. It promised knowledge, power, and mastery, but at the cost of everything that had once defined him, everything that had anchored him to the ideals of the Imperium and to his own identity. Even as he walked the halls of his flagship, the shadows clung and shifted in impossible ways. Soldiers moved with an uneasy precision, their loyalty intact yet subtly corrupted, their actions tinged with impulses they did not fully understand. Some muttered in dreams, their minds invaded by visions of impossible landscapes, of stars folding and reforming, of machinery fused with flesh in grotesque harmonies. Others stared into empty corridors, perceiving presences that were real yet not fully manifest. Horus felt each disturbance, each flicker of alien influence, with acute clarity. He had been at the heart of war, at the forefront of campaigns that spanned galaxies, yet he had never known dread such as this, a terror that was pervasive, insidious, and impossibly patient. Horus understood that he had changed irrevocably. The whispers that had guided him, the visions that had shaped him, and the shadows that had haunted him were not merely external. They were internalized, fused with his perception and thought. He could no longer separate himself from the forces that now coiled around him, that had entwined with his ambition and pride, that had transformed his understanding of loyalty, power, and destiny. The Primarch he had been, the commander, the son of the Emperor, the exemplar of the Luna Wolves, was now inseparable from the shadow that had insinuated itself into every corner of consciousness. His victories, his strategies, and his influence were now inseparable from the whispers of chaos, and he could sense that every action he would take in the future carried the imprint of this unseen hand. The galaxy itself seemed to respond to this transformation. Worlds that had been stable, planets that had been secure under imperial governance, now flickered with subtle anomalies, slight distortions in gravity, minute but pervasive fluctuations in radiation, unexplained temporal lapses that caused instruments and consciousness alike to question perception. The stars were no longer fixed points in space, but actors in a vast, incomprehensible stage. Even the familiar constellations appeared altered, their patterns shifting subtly in ways that suggested intelligence and intent. Horus could feel the pull of these cosmic forces, a rhythm that was neither hostile nor friendly, but inexorably deliberate, aligning with the cadence of the corruption that had taken root in his mind. The horror was no longer immediate or physical alone. It had become existential. Horus could sense the erosion of his own identity, the slow dissolving of certainty and will, replaced by an amalgam of ambition and external influence. Each thought he held, each impulse he acted upon, carried the residue of whispers that were neither wholly his nor entirely alien. He had become, in essence, a conduit for forces far beyond comprehension, a nexus where ambition, corruption, and cosmic inevitability intersected. Even as he retained consciousness and purpose, he understood that the Primarch he had been was gone, replaced by something both more and less than human, a figure poised at the edge of destiny, unbound by loyalty, morality, or the conventions of the galaxy. The soldiers under his command responded in kind. Their obedience was absolute, yet there was a subtle deviation, an almost imperceptible shift in perception and action that mirrored the corruption taking root in their leader. They moved with mechanical precision, yet their thoughts flickered with unfamiliar impulses. Some hesitated not out of fear, but because they perceived things that others could not. Shadows moving independently of light, whispers resonating through empty corridors, machinery pulsing with a life beyond comprehension. Even those who had been paragons of discipline and loyalty could not escape the subtle influence, the creeping insistence that reality itself had changed, and that the galaxy was now a stage for forces both alien and intimate. Horus walked through the command deck, observing these manifestations with an unnerving clarity. The screens and displays flickered with symbols that should not exist, glyphs that resonated with the whispers in his mind. The machinery of the Imperium, previously an extension of human will, now seemed almost sentient, responding to thought and action with anticipation that bordered on prescience. He touched the console, and the metal pulsed under his fingers, warm and alive, as though acknowledging him and yet asserting its own intent. The boundary between self and system, mind and universe, had dissolved entirely. He was both master and instrument, conscious and guided, terrified and exhilarated. Even the fabric of time and space seemed to bend around him. In moments of observation, the past and present coexisted, memories and visions intertwining with current perception. Horus saw campaigns he had yet to lead, victories he had yet to win, and betrayals he had yet to commit, all folded into a singular awareness. The whispers guided him, shaping understanding, revealing paths that were impossible yet inevitable, suggesting actions that were horrifying yet irresistible. He realized with a cold clarity that the future was no longer his to shape alone. It was a tapestry woven by forces both comprehensible and alien, with him as a central thread, yet not the loom. The psychological weight of this realization was immense. Horus experienced the thrill of absolute power, tempered by the terror of absolute uncertainty. Every decision carried consequences that rippled across consciousness and reality alike. The Imperium, the Luna Wolves, the Emperor. These were no longer constants, but variables in an equation far larger than any mortal mind could fully comprehend. The whispers of chaos had become a language, a system of guidance and influence that bypassed conventional thought, embedding suggestions directly into cognition, perception, and memory. Horus understood that resistance was no longer meaningful. Only navigation remained, a delicate balance between embracing and resisting, commanding and yielding. The corporeal horrors persisted in parallel with the psychic. Flesh and machine, already entwined, began to display subtle signs of mutation and adaptation. Servos moved in rhythms dictated not by command, but by the internalized cadence of corruption. Flesh graphs shifted slightly, patterns of pigmentation forming designs that echoed the symbols whispered in dreams. Even his own body responded to these influences, muscles twitching in anticipation, neural pathways firing in patterns beyond conscious control. Pain and pleasure, terror and exhilaration, obedience and defiance, all were layered upon one another in an intricate mosaic that Horus could feel in every fiber of his being. The horror was total, immersive, and inseparable from his own identity. In this state, Horus perceived the galaxy not as a backdrop for action, but as an organism of immense complexity and will. Planets, stars, void stations, and fleets were not mere objects or tools, but actors in a drama orchestrated by forces beyond understanding. The whispers, visions, and anomalies had converged into a pattern, a symphony of inevitability that suggested direction, purpose, and consequence. Horus felt his mind both expanding and contracting, aware of patterns that dwarfed even the most complex imperial strategies, yet limited by the need to navigate the pressures of influence and the demands of perception. It was a calculus of terror, ambition, and survival, a constant negotiation with forces simultaneously alien and intimate. The soldiers, the fleets, the Imperium itself responded in subtle resonance. Systems that had been ordered and predictable now exhibited deviations that reflected the psychological and cosmic pressures emanating from Horus. Battles unfolded with eerie precision, yet outcomes were influenced by patterns that seemed deliberately oblique, as though the universe itself had adopted a hand in strategy. Soldiers acted with efficiency yet uncertainty, their loyalty intertwined with impulses not entirely their own. Even the Emperor, distant and remote, exerted influence that Horus could perceive only as a shadow, a vibration through the fabric of reality, reinforcing both the inevitability and the terror of the unfolding events. And yet, despite the totality of horror, there was clarity. Horus perceived the shape of the future, the contours of choice, and the inevitability of transformation. He understood that the whispers of chaos, the distortions of reality, the subtle manipulations of perception, and the collapse of certainty were not merely assaults. They were instruments of revelation. They exposed the fragility of control, the malleability of identity, and the precariousness of loyalty and morality. In this understanding lay both exhilaration and despair, a recognition that he was both architect and instrument, observer and participant, master and servant of forces beyond comprehension. The climax of the horror was not a single event, but a state of being. Horus, standing at the center of his perception and influence, recognized the full scope of transformation. He was no longer merely a Primarch of the Emperor, no longer merely a commander of the Luna Wolves, no longer merely a figure of human ambition. He had become a nexus of power, perception, corruption, and inevitability, a conduit for forces that transcended morality, physics, and comprehension. The whispers, visions, shadows, and anomalies were not enemies to resist, but instruments to navigate, guides through a universe that had revealed itself as sentient, patient, and inscrutable. And yet, in this overwhelming awareness, in the total immersion of mind, body, and cosmos, into the cadence of horror and influence, Horus felt the first flicker of true autonomy. For a moment, he could choose how to move within the currents, to direct his perception and influence with deliberate intent. It was a terrifying freedom, for the stakes were total, and the consequences immediate and irreversible. The galaxy watched, the stars waited, the whispers pressed insistently, and he understood that the path ahead was one of eternal vigilance, constant negotiation, and perpetual tension between power and surrender. The immediate terror, the corporeal and psychic chaos, began to recede slightly, leaving behind the lingering weight of inevitability. Horus knew that the horror was not gone. It had not been vanquished. It had been internalized, fused with identity, and expanded into the galaxy itself. The whispers would continue, the visions would persist, the anomalies would recur, and the pressure of cosmic and moral inevitability would press upon him endlessly. The climax had not ended in triumph or defeat, but in understanding, a terrifying, exhilarating, and inescapable comprehension of the scale and nature of the forces now intertwined with his existence. In the final moments of this transformation, Horus gazed into the void beyond the observation deck, perceiving stars and fleets alike with awareness both precise and terrifyingly comprehensive. He understood the patterns, the pressures, the consequences, and the paths forward. Yet with understanding came unease. The horror, though internalized and navigated, remained present, a shadow of potential, an echo of inevitability. The whispers had not ceased. They had become part of the cadence of thought, shaping every perception and action. The universe itself had revealed its sentience, its patience, and its inscrutable intent. And Horus, standing at the center, was neither victim nor conqueror, but a nexus of all these forces, aware of the totality of horror and yet compelled to continue. He turned from the viewport, the whispers guiding yet not dictating, the shadows persistent yet navigable, the machinery alive and patient. The galaxy remained vast, indifferent, and inscrutable, yet he could move within it with purpose, shaped by corruption, knowledge, and ambition. He understood fully that the horror would never end. It would continue, pressing, whispering, observing as it had from the beginning. And he understood that he was now inseparable from it, both shaped and shaping, observer and instrument. The final truth of the universe had revealed itself, and it was patient, vast, and eternal. "They are still watching," he whispered, almost to himself, almost to the void. "Even in the dark, they're waiting." The galaxy remained silent, but Horus knew it was not still. The crescendo of horror had reached its apex, yet the echo of dread would reverberate endlessly, a persistent reminder that nothing was ever truly safe, and that the shadow of chaos and inevitability would continue to press against the Imperium, against him, and against all who believed in order and certainty. The journey was not over. It had only entered a new phase, one of eternal tension, awareness, and anticipation. Horus turned to the command deck, the machinery humming, the whispers persisting, and he began to move, to act, to lead, fully aware that every choice, every command, every breath would be shaped by the forces that had revealed themselves. And in that awareness, in that perpetual dread and exhilaration, the galaxy waited, patient, eternal, and observing. The shadow of horror lingered. The war would continue. The whispers would persist. The stars would remain vigilant. And Horus, Primarch of the Emperor, Traitor of the galaxy, and nexus of inevitability, would navigate it all, aware that the terror was never gone, only internalized and eternal.